and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, you have the next installment of recent reads. I just filmed the first clip of an unboxing, so I figured camera's all set up. Let me go ahead and do this recent reads before it gets too late in the week. So I have 3 books to talk about today. These are the last 3 books that I read in February. The first of those I read on Monday of this week, on the 27th, and that is Figure It Out, Henry Weldon. This is a physical copy of an ARC that I had, and I was really intrigued. I thought at first when I started reading it that I might have gone, oh, I should have saved that for Middle Grade March and the Neurodiverse Rep, because Henry has dyscalculia, which is difficulty with interpreting math and things related to numbers, like dyslexia with letters. The problem was, even though it's really hyper-focused on in the beginning and is mentioned sort of throughout the book, it kind of loses focus on this. Additionally, so she's starting a new school. Her mom is not working because she's working on her PhD, and so they can't afford to send her to private school anymore, so she's going to a public school. And this is just nitpicky to me because maybe schools in other places do it this way, but the whole lunch situation and the fact that they go wherever they want, basically for lunch, and sit wherever they want, and etc., that's just not how it functions, especially for middle school. Now, it functions somewhat that way in high school, and this is a school that is 7th through 12th, or 6th through 12th. So maybe, but I don't know of any administrator in their right mind that would organize lunches where all of those grades are together. You don't want a 6th grader or a 7th grader eating lunch when there's also 12th graders in there. It's just not a good mix. It's just a little pet peeve. So sometimes the school stuff just seems kind of like, I don't think they would do that. And then there was this thing about PE and her losing 100 points every time for not dressing out. My experience with schools, there's no way they would dock them those points if it was just no. So some of the school stuff, I don't know if it's a personal thing because of my experience in the school system. It's a rare occasion when they get that right. But this book also suffers from some interesting relationship building in this. She has a contentious relationship with her sister, which I understand. I think they're close in age. Her brother is there, but he kind of only makes spotty appearances. I'm like, why even bother with that character? The resolution never really happens because the problem is constantly shifting. Because it shifts from the dyscalculia to wanting to try out for soccer, to her balancing being on the soccer team and the time, and her wanting to submit poetry, and this bully of her sisters who is like a foster kid, but there's a group of foster kids, but she's like a popular mean girl, and nothing ever really resolves. It just kind of went, and then stopped. Okay? I'm not saying everything has to be perfect by the end of a book, but the plot development felt awkward. And so I ended up rating this 2.5 stars, which was kind of disappointing. The next book that I read, I will put up an image of it. It was another ARC because I had finished, with the exception of the last book that I'm going to talk about in just a moment, I had finished all of my TBR. And that was an ARC that I read on my Kindle, and that is The Lioness of Punjab. This was not a bad book. It just wasn't a great book either. It was a fictionalized biography of a very famous Sikh woman around the early 1700s, I believe. And so the course of the novel, which is only about 216 pages, goes from when she's younger until her death. There's not really time to delve into character motivations or developing a plot because the plot is basically her life and things that happen along her life. And also the author must be very familiar with the different words for relatives like mother, father, etc. And she doesn't really explain them at all. And because I don't have any familiarity with that language, it made it difficult at times to figure out Okay, who is she referring to? Who is this? That's her uncle? I thought that was the word for mom. So that made it a little bit difficult, but overall, I learned more about history, about the Sikh religion, about how these were involved. Fine, average read, nothing outstanding, 3-star read. Thankfully, the last book that I finished in February, I think I may have found a book that is probably going to be in contention for one of my favorites of the entire year. I don't see how it can be unseated unless I have another magic book like Babel, Rust in the Root by Justina Ireland. This is my second book that I've read by her. Second 5-star. So I've read both books that I've read, 5 stars. The other book that I have read from her is Ophi's Ghosts, which is a middle grade book published in 21. This was published last year. I picked this up at the Strand. I was looking for Dread Nation, which is on my 23 and 23 list. No, it's on my Buzzwordathon TBR. And I've wanted to get to that, and my brother-in-law has read that and loves it because I remember learning about that because my sister and brother-in-law were actually the one that purchased me a hard copy of Ophi's Ghosts. And he's like, oh, I didn't know she wrote middle grade. I love her works. I'm going to strongly recommend this to him. This book, it took me a little while to figure out the meaning of the title. Now looking back, I'm like, oh, duh. So root is getting at root magic. And then the rust is from all the mechanical advancements and how it interplays. This book is an alternate history where Justina Ireland takes all of these different magical things and weaves them so intertwined with actual historical events that by changing it to a magical item or a magical thing that happened, it illuminates what really happened or was happening in that time so much. It's so hard to describe because it's just brilliant. I'm going to say one thing from the end. Something it's mentioned, said they're describing a tree and say that it has strange fruit. As soon as I heard that, I'm just like, oh my word, Justina Ireland, you are brilliant. Of course, I'm not going to say anything more than that. If you know, you know. The world, this is Depression era, and the main character is going to New York from this small rural Pennsylvania town because she basically wants to get a license to be a mage so she can have this amazing bakery. She doesn't end up doing that. Spoiler alert. And so she ends up working for this bureau. I forget what the exact name is, but you know, in the Depression era, there were a lot of different things created to help people with employment and etc. And what they're battling is the Great Rust. And I think it's sort of the idea of the things that happened because of the Great Rust, because of the Dust Bowl. It's that sort of similar thing. And most African Americans use what they call the mystical arts. So things like floromancy, working with plants, faunomancy, working with animals, sonomancy, health, etc. And the white people, everybody else, what's in power, works with mechamancy, which is, you can hear mechanical stuff, machines, and that's sort of a combination of science and alchemy, is how she describes it. And this is supposed to be these great advancements, and that's how all of these different things are being built, like the Empire State Building. And the Empire State Building was built during the Great Depression. But there's problems in these different areas, in these Great Rust areas, and they're going to try to clean up. They're like the cleanup crew. They're trying to fix these Great Blight areas, But there is a Great Blight in Ohio, which is where they end up spending most of the time. And it turns out that something else is at work. Not only does she have a really solid, interesting plot with complex characterizations, but she combines that with that magical infusion of this real world. It's like it doesn't change the course of history. All of these things happen. They just have a magical explanation that explains so much more. And for this context-loving, fantasy-loving girl here, this is another book that seems like it was perfectly created for me. I loved this book so much. It, when I put it through CAWPILE, had a 9.57 out of 10. I think there's only a handful of books that I've given 10s across the board for CAWPILE. This one had 2 9s and the rest 10s. I forget what the 9s were for. But I loved this book so much. It is amazing. Okay, so I am back for part 2 of this week's recent reads. Another 3 books to talk about. One of the reasons that I didn't update about this first book when I finished it is because it took me a while and writing out my review to really figure out how to talk about it. And that is Furia by Jamile Said Mendez. This is, I believe, Own Voices. She is Argentinian. I don't know how much other stuff she has in common with the main character here. I was really intrigued by this book because it takes place in an area of the world where not a lot of people talk about it, at least in YA books and etc. It takes place in Argentina. It deals with a lot of really deep subjects, like the idea that these countries are so football crazy. Like, you know, it's Argentina. Like, they just won the 2022 World Cup. Obviously, that was after this book was published. And they have really good teams and players for the men because they support them. And it's really looked down upon for women to play soccer, which is baffling. And I was really intrigued for this book for that reason. And Mendez talks about a lot of these different issues. The main character, is an incredibly talented futbolera, female soccer player, and she has to sneak around to play on this team. She played up until she was 12. Then she was not allowed to keep playing. There weren't teams or anything available until this coach found her and brought her on, but she still had to sneak around. So it's dealing with that. It's dealing with the whole, the missing and murdered women, the violence that runs rampant against women in this culture, and the misogyny behind it. It deals with domestic abuse because her father is a piece of work. He's awful. He's absolutely awful. In the way that he treats her mom, he treats his own son, he treats her. There was a lot going on with it. And I thought, okay, this is something that I can get into. But very early on, this becomes almost like a love story, becomes almost like a romance, because this person that she grew up with, who now plays for Juventus in Italy, he's come back to visit, and they grew up, they had a really good interaction, but when he left the year before, like they kissed and then he left and broke her heart and etc. And so much of the first third focuses on this romance, and I'm seeing so many warning signs throughout this. I'm like, So the guy's not bad. He's not like her father. But at the same time, I'm like, wait, why is our focus all on this? Why are we shifting this focus? And then there were some weird character interactions. Like, she has this best friend who seems to do a lot, like their families are really close and etc. But there were a lot of different miscommunications, or like her friend just completely turning her back on her because of this relationship and refusing to talk to her. And then they'd get back together in friendship and she'd be like, oh, this is my BFF. This is why she's my best friend, and like soulmate friendships, which didn't make a lot of sense. And then there would also be conversations where, you know, that she was having serious conversations with different people, a lot of times with the love interest, where they would be talking about something really important, but then something would interrupt. Music, another person, summing up a cellar of roses on the beach where they were, or whatever, and they would never get back and actually conclude the conversation, which it happened so often that I got really frustrated by it. I think it tried to tackle too much, and the characterization was weird. So unfortunately, I will be unhauling this one. Then we come to a book that I knew was going to be hard-hitting, and that is Medical Apartheid by Harriet A. Washington. I listened to this as an audiobook, and I realized about halfway through, I'm like, wait a second, this is written by a woman, but it's narrated by a man. And I couldn't shake that. So that was a weird thing about the audiobook. But I knew going into this would end up being a litany of all the terrible things that have been done to African Americans, Africans, because it brought in some things that had been done by the United States in, like, on the continent. The subtitle here is The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. And that's literally what it is. It is so dark. There's just there's no redeeming quality to what has happened to Black Americans throughout this history that's talked about in here. And it explains so much about how people respond today to modern medicine. And some of the stuff I knew about, like I knew about the Tuskegee study, I knew about a handful of the other things like Dr. Sims, the father of modern gynecology, and what he did to female slaves, enslaved Africans. But some of the stuff I didn't know, and it just was kind of like bam, 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 all this terrible stuff. And I really, really appreciate learning about that. And something else that I really appreciated about this was the way that Washington ended with an epilogue. She took all of the stuff that she'd been laying out for centuries, and it's like she posed the question of what now? What do we need to do to fix this? And everything that she laid out here addressed something that she had discussed earlier in the book. And I thought that was just really well done. So I highly recommend this book. The last book that I read this week is Wondersmith, The Calling of Morrigan Crow. This is book 2 in the Nevermore series. I really enjoyed returning to this world. There's a different touch on the whimsy in this world because it's not like she's coming to it brand new. She's had a year in this world. She's part of the Wonder Society, and she thinks that she's finally going to have a family. She's finally going to have friends. Like, she appreciates Hawthorne, who's her best friend, diehard best friend throughout this. Love Hawthorne. But she thinks she'll be able to learn more and expand her world a little bit. But it's really interesting to see how she continues to be treated so poorly because of the trauma-induced prejudices that these people have against Wondersmiths because of Ezra Squall. And it's really interesting to look at it from that way because Ezra Squall did some terrible things to their world, and it sort of has colored their view of all Wondersmiths, because a lot of the terrible things he did they came out of his power. And that is now transferring onto Morrigan, even though she's a completely different person. She's not drawn to those certain things. And because of these prejudices like that, don't teach her about her abilities, and things happen and they blame her for it. And they say this as proof that she's evil. And it's really interesting as well how it plays with the characterizations of people who are supposed to be good and of the Wondersmith himself, of Ezra Squall. Like, he's supposed to be completely evil, and yet he's the one that gives her some of these lessons that helps her control her power. But at the same time, she's looking at the other stuff he's doing and going, that's evil, that's terrible. I don't want to be associated with that. And so it's just really fascinating how Jessica Townsend deals with that throughout this book. I did find the way that the elders dealt with some of the stuff, like a reveal at the end, it felt a little bit Deus Ex Machina, but at the same time, this is a middle grade book, so you have to give them a little bit of that. There you go. There are all the books that I read this week. Not too shabby of a week, because this week did in fact contain a book that has skyrocketed to the top of my 2023 reads with Rust in the Root. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.